On a quiet afternoon, the doors of Chase City Bank creaked open, and in walked Mary Bennett, an elderly woman dressed in worn clothes and carrying a frayed canvas bag. The room filled with judgmental glances as she moved with purpose to the center of the lobby. When she calmly declared, "This bank and belongs to me," laughter erupted from the crowd, but she remained unmoved. With slow, deliberate movements, she opened her bag and pulled out an ancient ledger, its pages yellowed with age. As the room fell silent, Keith Armstrong, the bank manager, stared in disbelief as Mary revealed signatures and documents that should have been forgotten long ago. Her name, Elijah C.K. Kirby, was there, on the original founding papers of the bank. The room, once filled with mockery, now simmered with doubt. Keith's heart raced as the truth began to surface, and the air thickened with the weight of history about to be rewritten. What was buried for decades was now out in the open. Will anyone believe Mary's claim? And what happens when the lies that have shaped an institution for years finally collapse? Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. On a quiet afternoon, the sun cast its golden light through the large windows of Chase City Bank. The sound of clicking keyboards and low murmurs filled the air as clients, dressed in their business attire, waited patiently in line. Some scrolled through their phones while others tapped their feet in impatience. The marble floors gleamed under the soft light, and the atmosphere was calm, until the door swung open with a creak, drawing everyone's attention. An elderly woman stepped into the bank, her presence immediately noticeable despite her humble appearance. She wore a long, dark brown coat, its fabric patched in several places. Dust clung to it as though the coat had seen years of wear. Her silver hair, tied loosely in a bun, had several strands slipping free and framing her face. Her shoes were worn thin, nearly to the soles, and her back was slightly hunched, yet there was a quiet pride in the way she carried herself. The bag slung over her shoulder was frayed at the edges, heavy with an unknown weight. She walked slowly, each step deliberate, her eyes scanning the room around her. Mary Bennett, as she was called, moved with purpose, but it was as if she had no intention of making her presence known just yet. That didn't stop the curious stares from the people around her. A few heads turned, their eyes narrowing with disbelief or judgment. Whispers began to rise as the elderly woman approached the center of the bank's lobby. The tension in the air was almost palpable, as though everyone could feel that something was about to happen. At the ATM in the corner, a sharply dressed woman gripped her purse tightly and looked at Mary with a mixture of confusion and concern. The bank tellers Josh and Martin exchanged glances and chuckled quietly as they watched her approach. "Probably lost," Josh muttered under his breath, a smirk on his face. "Or thinks this is a shelter," Martin added, rolling his eyes. The old woman reached the center of the room and stopped. The chatter and clicking continued around her, but there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. People began to glance at her more openly, their curiosity piqued by her calm, composed presence. She stood still for a moment, surveying the room with quiet confidence. Her deep brown eyes met those of the onlookers, many of whom stared back at her with confusion or open disdain. But Mary didn't flinch. She simply took a breath and, in a voice that was quiet but unwavering, spoke the words that would change everything. "This bank," she said, her voice carrying across the room, "belongs to me." The room fell silent for a few seconds. The sound of murmurs stopped, and a few people exchanged confused glances. And then, just as quickly, the laughter began. It started from the back of the room where a man let out a hearty chuckle. His laughter was quickly joined by others, and soon, the whole lobby was filled with mocking laughter. Some of the customers shook their heads, muttering to each other. Even Josh and Martin leaned over the counter, snickering. "This is a new one," Josh said with a grin. "She thinks she owns the place." Stephen Miller, the bank's tall security guard, stood near the entrance, his expression hardening. Known for his no-nonsense attitude, Stephen's hand casually dropped to his belt, where the outline of his gun holster rested. He was ready to step in if needed, and he didn't like what he was seeing. He watched Mary approach the front desk, her steps slow but confident. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharp and patronizing as he walked toward her. "This isn't a place for whatever this is. You need to leave before we have a problem." Mary turned her head slowly to face him. Her expression remained calm, her eyes never leaving his. She wasn't intimidated by the guard's stance or his words. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said softly. "I've come to take back what's mine." Stephen snorted in disbelief, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah? And what exactly is that?" "This bank," Mary said again, her voice a little louder now. "Chase Bank, founded in 1948, by me." More laughter erupted from the crowd. One man near the back raised his hand dramatically and shouted, "Someone call a hospital, this woman's lost her mind." But Mary didn't flinch. Instead, she reached down into her bag and began to pull something out. Stephen's posture stiffened, slightly, and his eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively shifting closer to his holster. What was she pulling out of that bag? The curiosity in the room grew, and even the employees behind the counter stopped what they were doing, leaning forward to see what would happen next. With slow, deliberate movements, Mary took out a bundle, wrapped in old cloth. She set it gently on the floor, unfolding it with care. Her hands shook ever so slightly, but there was no hesitation in her movements. One layer of cloth, then another, until a weathered leather ledger appeared. The pages were yellowed with age, and the edges had worn smooth from years of handling. Alongside the ledger were stacks of old currency notes, all bearing the unmistakable Chase Bank logo. The room grew quiet again, but this time, it wasn't the laughter of mockery. It was something else, something uncertain. Mary stood up straight, holding the ledger close to her chest. She looked around the room, her eyes sweeping over the people, who had laughed at her only moments ago. "This," she said, her voice steady and clear, "is the original ledger of Chase Bank. My name is in here. I am Mrs. Elijah C.K. Kirby, and this bank was stolen from me." A chill ran through the room. The laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what she had just said hung heavily in the air. The world outside the bank seemed to disappear, leaving only the fragile documents in Mary's hands and the truth they represented. The story had only just begun. But in that moment, the room knew nothing would ever be the same again. As the silence lingered, the bank's atmosphere grew heavier with uncertainty. Customers who had once laughed at the elderly woman now watched her with wary eyes. The words she had spoken echoed in their minds, and something deep inside them began to stir, a feeling that perhaps they had underestimated her. But even in the face of growing disbelief, no one moved. No one spoke. Mary Bennett stood tall in the center of the lobby, clutching the ledger against her chest as if it were something sacred. The faded gold lettering on the cover glinted in the dim light, and the weight of its history seemed to press down on the room. Slowly, she set the book down on the marble counter, the soft thud of its landing sending a ripple of tension through the air. The ledger, its edges worn and crinkled from years of use, seemed almost out of place in the modern world of polished marble and sleek glass counters. Yet, it was the one thing in that room that carried the undeniable weight of truth. Keith Armstrong, the bank manager, had been standing behind the counter, frozen in disbelief. His eyes had been fixed on the ledger, and for the first time in his professional career he felt a flicker of doubt. His gaze shifted from the book to Mary, then back to the documents she had laid out on the table. His fingers twitched at his sides as if the evidence before him demanded action, but he was unsure where to begin. The murmurs began again, quieter this time, but no less intense. A woman near the back of the room whispered to her companion, "This is ridiculous, there's no way this is real." Her voice trembled with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "Maybe it's just an old scam," another customer muttered, crossing his arms and shifting uncomfortably. "Who's going to believe this?" Mary remained unfazed by the comments, her gaze unwavering as she met the eyes of every person in the room. She had heard all the doubts before. It wasn't the first time people had questioned her, dismissed her, or laughed at her. In fact, it was the story of her life. But she wasn't here to fight for their approval. She was here for justice. The truth had been buried for too long, and now, at last, she had come to reclaim it. Keith finally took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cautious but firm. "I'm not sure what this is, but this bank has been owned by the Matthews family for 3 generations. They're a respected name in the community. I don't think you're—" He stopped himself, his words faltering as he caught the look in Mary's eyes. There was a quiet strength there, something that made him hesitate, something that told him there was more to this than he had first thought. "I'm not mistaken," Mary said softly but firmly. "This bank was founded by me, Elijah C.K. Kirby. I built it from nothing." She paused, her eyes flickering briefly to the old ledger. "I had a partner. His name was Robert Matthews. He helped me, or so I thought." Keith's face remained neutral, but inside, a storm of confusion and doubt was raging. He had spent years working at the bank, studying its history, its founding, and the story of the Matthews family. He knew every detail of their legacy, or so he had believed. But now, standing in front of him was a woman whose words were shaking the very foundation of everything he had ever known. "What do you mean, stolen?" Keith asked, his voice quieter now. He was no longer dismissing her. He was listening, truly listening to what she was saying. Mary's eyes darkened and her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the first page of the ledger. She ran her fingers over the faded ink, the signatures of herself and Robert Matthews unmistakable. "We opened this bank together. It was meant to be a place where everyone could find safety, security, and fairness," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of unspoken pain. But as soon as it began to thrive, Robert changed. He met in secret with his family, the Matthews family. They told him that no one would trust a bank founded by a black woman. They said it would ruin their reputation, and so they erased me from history. Keith felt a knot tighten in his chest. The story sounded absurd, impossible even. But the evidence was right in front of him. This was no ordinary woman, no ordinary claim. The ledger in her hands, the documents scattered across the table, they were real. He could see it in the way the ink had faded, the seals that still held their mark. "How do you expect me to believe this?" Keith asked, his voice cracking slightly. "This isn't just something we can change overnight. There are records, court cases. The Matthews family has been in control for decades." "I know," Mary replied. "I tried to fight back. I had lawyers. I went to court. But back then, no one wanted to listen. They told me I was just an old woman, a nobody. They erased me, wiped my name from the books, and no one cared. But I've kept the proof. For all these years, I've held on to the truth." She reached into the bag again, pulling out more faded documents. "Now, it's time for the world to know. Time for them to see the lies." As she laid out the legal documents, property deeds, loan agreements, and business registrations, Keith's mind raced. Every signature, every date, every seal matched perfectly with what Mary had said. He had never seen documents like this, never heard of a woman like her, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. "Why come now?" Keith asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why after all these years?" Mary's eyes softened, her expression becoming more introspective. "Because now I have the truth. For decades, I was silenced. But today, I've come to speak. Today, I begin to take back what was stolen." Keith stood motionless, his mind struggling to keep up with the unfolding events. Mary's words were heavy with conviction, her evidence irrefutable. The room around him seemed to blur, the faces of the customers fading into the background as he focused on the woman before him. For the first time, Keith felt something stir deep inside him, a recognition that this wasn't just an old story, an old injustice. This was a reckoning, and it had arrived at his doorstep. Around him the murmurs had quieted. Even the laughter had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. The truth, so long buried, was now emerging, and no one in that room could pretend they hadn't seen it. The tension was unbearable as Keith slowly looked from the documents in his hands to the elderly woman who had come to claim what was rightfully hers. The truth had found its voice, and it was loud enough to shake the foundations of Chase City Bank. The quiet hum of the bank seemed almost too loud in the wake of Mary Bennett's revelation. The tension in the room was so thick, it was as if the very walls of Chase City Bank had drawn in a breath, waiting for what would come next. The employees who had been so eager to dismiss Mary as nothing more than a confused old woman now found themselves standing on the edge of something they had never expected, the possibility that she was right. Keith Armstrong, still holding the stack of documents in his hand, felt a weight he had never experienced before. It wasn't just the burden of responsibility that rested on his shoulders. It was the realization that everything he had known about the bank, about its history, might have been built on a lie. As he looked around the room, his eyes met the gazes of the employees, the customers, all of them now silent, uncertain, waiting for him to make the next move. It was as if they were all holding their breath, watching him for a sign that he knew what to do. But how could he know? The room was frozen in place, the once skeptical bank employees now sharing uneasy glances. Even Charles Gray, the security guard who had once treated Mary like an intruder, now stood quietly by the door, his arms crossed tightly, his face betraying a hint of doubt. There was no longer any certainty in the room, no easy answers. It was Emily Turner, a young teller who first moved. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the polished marble floor as she approached the table where Mary had placed the ledger and documents. Emily had been watching the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something deeper, a stirring inside her that she couldn't quite explain. She had seen the way Mary had spoken, the calm strength in her voice that had started to chip away at her own skepticism. And as Emily examined the yellowed papers on the table, something inside her clicked into place. She knew the truth when she saw it. "Keith," Emily said softly, her voice breaking through the silence. "You've seen these documents. I've seen the same type of paperwork in the vaults. I've handled records just like these. They match." Keith's gaze shifted from Emily back to the documents. He hadn't wanted to believe it. His whole life had been centered around the Matthews family and their legacy, and now the foundations of his career seemed to be crumbling. But Emily's words, quiet and measured, were like the first cracks in a dam that had held for too long. The evidence was here. It was undeniable. A murmur rippled through the employees and customers. Some shifted uncomfortably, while others nodded in quiet agreement. A sense of unease lingered in the air, but there was something else now too, a sense of possibility of change that no one had expected. "We can't just pretend this didn't happen," Emily continued, her eyes now locking with Keith's. "We have to stand up for what's right." Keith stood still, torn between the weight of what he knew to be true and the life he had, built in the Matthews family's shadow. He had always believed in the power of tradition, of the history that had been handed down to him. But now, that history was being called into question by a woman whose name had been erased, whose legacy had been stolen. And no matter how much he wanted to deny it, he knew that Emily was right. A quiet voice from the back of the room interrupted his thoughts. It was Lillian Scott, one of the younger employees, who had been silent until now. "Keith," she said, her tone gentle but firm, "we can't ignore this. Mary has been telling us the truth. We've been living a lie. We have to do something." Her words were a turning point. The room seemed to shift in an instant. The hesitation that had once gripped the employees began to break apart. The walls that had held their loyalty to the Matthews family were crumbling, and in their place a new sense of responsibility was rising. Keith turned to face the others. His throat tightened as he struggled to find the right words. But when he finally spoke, his voice was resolute. "You're right," he said, his words carrying more weight than he had intended. "This isn't just about the bank. It's about what's right. We can't let this go." With those words, something changed in the room. The employees who had once laughed at Mary now stood with her, silently acknowledging the injustice she had suffered. Emily stepped forward again, picking up the ledger from the table and holding it up for everyone to see. "This is the truth," she said quietly, "and we can't allow it to be buried any longer." Keith nodded, feeling the first stirrings of courage within him. He turned to Mary, who had been watching the exchange with a quiet determination. There was no arrogance, in her expression no bitterness, just a calm certainty that she had come to reclaim what was rightfully hers. "Mary," Keith said, his voice softer now, "we need to take this to the board. The Matthews family may be the ones in control now, but the truth is on your side, and we will fight for it." Mary looked at him, her gaze steady, her hands still resting on the ledger. "I didn't come here to fight," she said. "I came to restore what was taken from me, to make sure that no one else ever has to go through what I did." Keith's heart sank as he realized the full weight of her words. The fight wasn't just about the bank, it was about something far larger. It was about justice, about giving a voice to the voiceless. And in that moment, he understood that Mary's battle was his own. It was a battle for truth. The tension in the room had shifted. The employees who had once mocked Mary now stood beside her, their expressions one of quiet respect. Charles, the security guard, who had been so eager to throw her out just an hour ago, now stood at the back of the room, his face drawn, as if he too had begun to realize the depth of the injustice. Even the customers, once skeptical, now looked on with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Emily placed a hand on the counter, her eyes filled with quiet resolve. "I'll support you, Mary," she said, her voice unwavering. "And I know we can make this right." For the first time, the truth felt real. No longer just a story or a memory, but a force that was beginning to take shape. The room, once filled with mockery and doubt, was now filled with the weight of history, the weight of what had been stolen and what was now being returned. As the truth began to settle into the room, the sense of discomfort grew. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a feeling of quiet shame. But there was no turning back now. The truth had been spoken, and with it, the possibility of justice had been awakened. Mary Bennett stood in the center of the room, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. She had claimed her place in history, and she was ready to take the next step. The battle had only just begun. The air inside Chase City Bank had changed irreparably. What started as a typical afternoon filled with routine transactions, soft murmurs, and the clicking of keyboards had shifted into something far greater. The once pristine walls now seemed to vibrate with the weight of history. The room, once filled with the familiar hum of daily life, had become a battleground for truth. And at the center of it all stood Mary Bennett, her presence as unyielding as the truth she had come to reveal. Keith Armstrong, the bank manager, stood with the stack of documents still clutched in his hands, as though they were the very foundation of the world he had once known. His eyes moved slowly from the papers to the faces of the people around him. The employees, once loyal to the Matthews family, now stood with quiet defiance, their eyes filled with a mix of respect and regret. It was as if the truth had lit a fire inside them, and they no longer had the luxury of staying silent. Lillian Scott, a young employee who had been one of the first to speak up in support of Mary, stood beside Keith. She had always respected the institution she worked for, but now she could no longer ignore the injustice that had been done. Her hands shook slightly as she reached for one of the old yellowed banknotes that had fallen to the floor. It had once held value in the bank's heyday, but now it symbolized something far more significant. A lost legacy, a forgotten woman, whose contributions had been erased from history. Mary stood quietly in the center of the room, her back straight despite the years of hardship she had endured. She didn't look around at the employees or the customers who now watched her with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Instead, she focused on the old ledger she had placed on the table, her fingers gently caressing the pages, as though the words within them held more weight than anything she had ever known. For decades, she had lived with the knowledge that her name had been erased, that her legacy had been stolen, but today she had come to reclaim it. She had fought battles in courtrooms and she had fought battles in her heart. But now, as she looked around the room, she realized that the true battle was just beginning. not in the courts, but in the hearts and minds of those who had been blind to the truth for so long. The silence stretched on, growing thicker with each passing second. The weight of Mary's words, her evidence, and her unwavering presence had begun to sink in. The employees, once so quick to mock her, now stood still, their expressions hard to read. Charles Gray, the security guard, who had once been so dismissive of Mary, now stood near the door, his arms crossed tightly. His posture was stiff and his jaw was set in a grim line. It was clear that the events of the past hour had shaken him to his core. Keith took a deep breath and stepped forward, his eyes still locked on Mary. His hands trembled slightly as he held out the stack of documents. "Mary," he said, his voice more steady than he had expected. "I've reviewed everything. The ledger, the signatures, the legal documents. Everything matches. The Matthews family. They didn't build this bank. You did. This is your legacy." Mary's eyes softened as she met Keith's gaze. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement of the truth. "I didn't build this place for recognition," she said, her voice low and calm. "I built it because I believed in fairness, I believed in equality. I believed that a place like this could change lives, that it could serve everyone no matter who they were. But they took that away from me. They took everything I built and erased me from it." Keith's heart clenched as he heard the pain in her words. He had spent his entire career working under the Matthews family's name, believing in the history they had told him. But now, that history was crumbling before him, piece by piece, and he was left to pick up the shattered remnants. The Matthews family's name had been built on lies, on the erasure of a woman who had poured her heart and soul into creating something that was meant to serve everyone. Mary's eyes lingered on the documents in Keith's hands, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. "They thought they could silence me," she murmured. "But the truth never stays buried. Not forever." The tension in the room had shifted. The employees, once divided between skepticism and disbelief, were now united in the knowledge that they had witnessed a monumental moment. The truth had been exposed and there was no going back. Keith nodded slowly, his mind racing as he processed everything. "I'll take these documents to the board," he said, his voice steady now, filled with a newfound resolve. "We'll make sure your name is restored. This bank, your legacy, will be recognized, I promise." Mary gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "But this isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to live with the injustice I faced. It's about giving a voice to those who've been silenced for too long." The room was still, but the air had changed. The employees, who had once dismissed Mary as a mere figment of history, now stood in solidarity with her. One by one, they began to step forward, their actions small but significant. Lillian picked up another old banknote from the floor and placed it gently on the table beside the ledger. Then Emily, then Josh, and then Martin, each of them placing a note down in front of Mary as a symbol of apology, of recognition, of respect. Charles, who had been standing near the door, took a hesitant step forward. He had been the most vocal in his dismissal of Mary, but now as he watched his colleagues, he felt a shift in himself. Slowly he reached for a bill and placed it next to the others. It wasn't much, but it was all he could offer. For the first time, the bank was no longer a place of control and power. It had become a space for reflection, for reconciliation. The truth had been spoken, and no one could deny it. The Matthews family's name, once synonymous with wealth and power, was now tainted by the revelation of their betrayal, and in its place Mary's name, Elijah C.K. Kirby, was being restored to the history it had always deserved. As the employees stood in a quiet circle around Mary, Keith took one final look at the documents. "We're going to do this right," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll take it to the board, we'll take it to the press. This truth won't be silenced again." Mary smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's been a long time coming." And with that, the room shifted once more, as though the air itself had been cleared. The legacy of Elijah C.K. Kirby once hidden in the shadows, had finally been brought into the light. And as Mary Bennett turned to leave, her canvas bag now filled with the weight of history, she knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice had just begun, and with the truth on her side, she would never be silenced again.